Hey guys, I'm back with a new video. In this video, let us learn about controlled components in React. Now what do you mean by controlled components? Now a controlled component is a component for which the developer is responsible for controlling the state of the component. So for example, you can define a form in two ways. One is using the input controls that you are already familiar with that are controlled, for which what we do is that we pass in a value and keep that value in sync with the state as the user types in the input control field. Now this does involve a little more work, but once you write this a few times, it will become a second nature. So let us define a form component, and I've already prepared some CSS for forms, which is for our registration form that we will be creating in just a minute. And I'm also using materialized CSS for styling the form. The link for the course files can be found down below this video. So now without wasting any more time, let us define our form component, and let us have three input controls for our form, namely username, email, and password. Let us also set up a feedback piece or state along with the state for the form data. So let us go to our components folder, and right inside this I've created a form folder in which we are having a form.css file, and let us create a new component and name this as form.js, and let us lay down the structure of our React component. So import React from React, and let us import our CSS file. So import ./form.css const form arrow function. So first let us import the useState hook from React and set our piece of state for the form data, which includes username, email, and password. Now we already know that the useState hook gives us exactly two arguments. One is the piece of state, another one is the handler to set that piece of state. So let us import it right here. useState, and here I will define form data set form data useState, and pass to this an object. So username, set that to empty quotes, password, set that to empty quotes, and email. So next let us set up a piece of state for feedback. So feedback, set feedback useState, and set this to an empty string. As initial value, set feedback is the handler to set this piece of state. Now from right inside the function, let us return some JSX code for our form. So return, and now let us define a div and give this a class of register and container, and this register class I've already provided in form.css. So for the div, I want a max width of 400 pixels and a margin top of 60 pixels. Now here we are making use of the materialized classes along with some predefined class that you can find in the course files, which I've defined in form.css. Now let us define a couple of h2s. So h2, and to the first one let us give a class of center and pink text, and let us say register, and then we'll also render whatever we have in the form. So whatever the user types in form, h2 class name of center deep purple text, which is a materialized class, and here to render the username I can say form data dot username, and then let us copy this and paste it down below 2 times. Let us change this to password and this to email, and right next to this we will render our feedback. So h2 center deep purple text and feedback. Now let us define our input fields for email, username, and password. So first one is username. So let us define a div for this and give it a class of field. So field. Then we need a label element that describes the input element. So label HTML for username, input type text, name as username, ID as username, placeholder, enter the username. Now this label element describes the input element, and you can see we are making use of the HTML for attribute which is a JSX attribute, which is equivalent to the for attribute in HTML, which, as I already told you in the video of JSX, that we cannot use here because for is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, just like the class keyword, for which we are using class name here. Next, let us set the value of email form control to what we have in the state. So value, and use the curly braces and set this to form data dot username. So now we want the ability to change the value of email control. So for this we need to listen for the change event on the email control. This way we can set the value that the user types in our email piece of state, and whatever value you now get is reflected right here because we are pulling that value from our piece of state and setting that to the value attribute of the control. So this way we keep our input control in sync with the state. So let us add an onChange attribute and set this to handle change function that I will define in just a minute. So now let us copy this entire field and paste it down below and change this to email and let me select this multiple times and change this to email here as well. So type as email. So now let us again copy this and paste it down below for password. Let us select this multiple times and change to password, this as capital. And here you can again see that we are listening for the change event on our input controls, and once the change event occurs we trigger the handle change function that I am going to define in just a minute. So the onChange handler will listen for the change event on these controls that we have defined, and along with the value attribute it will make sure that our input controls are in sync with the state of our component. Also, one thing more, whatever we have in this div tag should go inside the form. So let me cut this out first and add a form tag and give this a class name of card panel. So card-panel. So now in order to see how our form actually looks like, let us import this component in our app component. Import form from ./components/form/F form. Let's remove this and render the form right here. Also let us export our form component down below. So export default form. Now before handling the form submission, let us first define the onChange handler for our form controls. So let us go right above and define this. So right here let us define the handle change function. So handle change, which receives the event object and whatever value we get from the control on which the change event gets triggered, let us commit that to our form data state. So it's gonna be very simple. We just need to call the handler set form data. So set form data, and this handler is responsible for changing the form data state. So let us use the spread operator to spread the controls that we have and override them with the current value that we get from the control on which the change event gets triggered. So here we can make use of the name attribute that we defined on the control in order to refer the element. So event.target.name. So this is the target on which the change event got triggered, and we are using the name attribute to refer that element, and then whatever value the user types in the control field, we can get that by saying event.target.value and commit that right inside the form state by using the handler to change our form data piece of state, right? So here you can see the name attribute, email, password and username matches with the keys of our form data state. So that is how we are able to map the value that we are getting from these controls to our state. So now let us go down below and define the div which will hold our button element. So div field and class of center, and then a button with a class of btn and pink and say register. And now let us go right above and listen for the onSubmit event on our form element. So right here, let us add the onSubmit handler. So onSubmit handle form submission. And once the submit event occurs on the form, this function will get triggered that I'm going to define in just a minute. So let us go right here and define the handle form submission function. So handle form submission, and this will receive the event object. And first, let us prevent the default behavior of the form submission. So event.prevent default. Now let us define a validate function for validating our form controls. And for now, just simply check whether we do have anything in the form controls or not. So right here, let us define the validate function, and this will receive the form data. And let us destructure out the email, password and username from the form data. So const from the form data, let's destructure username, email and password. And next, let us create an errors object and set that to empty curly braces. And right inside this, we will collect the errors that we get. So now if we do not have any value specified for our form fields in our form data state, then we can set an error message for them indicating that the field is blank. We don't have a value for email. Let us add an error for email. Email cannot be blank. Let us copy this and paste it down below 2 times and change this to username. So if the user doesn't specify any value for username, then we can say username cannot be blank. And same can be done for the password. Password cannot be blank. Now once we have collected all the errors, let us return the errors to the caller of this function. So return errors. So let us go right inside the handle form submission function, and let us invoke the validate function by passing the form data that we have in the state, and this will spit out the errors if any. So let us collect them in a constant. So const errors, and let us commit the errors to our error state. So let us define an error state as well. So right here, let me copy this and paste it down below and change this to errors, set errors, and the initial state as empty curly braces. So an empty object. So whatever errors that we get from our validate function, let us commit that to our errors piece of state. So set errors, call the handler and pass the errors object to this. So let us check whether we do have any errors or not. So if object dot keys errors dot length is 0, which means that if our errors object is empty, that is, it is not having the keys of username, email, password. If we do have the values for email, username, password, then our errors object will be completely empty. And for an empty errors object, we are not going to have any keys on that, so its length will be 0, indicating that the form is a valid one. So here I can log to the console, form is now submitted, HTTP call to server, and console.log form data. And now let us set the form state to its original configuration with the empty values, just as we had in the start. So set form data and username to an empty string, password to an empty string, email to an empty string. And let us also set the feedback by saying set feedback, you are now registered and can log in. So now let us go right inside our JSX code. And now if we do have any errors, let us render them right above our form controls and right below the beginning of our form tag. So for rendering them to the browser, I can say object.values to get the values for the error key that we set up in the errors object. And for all the errors, we can map over them, and for each error, let us prepare a h2 tag and give this a key of error and a class name of center and red text. Let us change this to h6 so it looks a bit smaller, and here I can interpolate error like this. So let us head over to the browser to see what we get. So right inside the browser you can see our form with the username, email and password controls. So let us inspect and let us open our components in the React Dev tools. Currently you can see we are using the useState hook to manage our state. So we are having an email field, a password field and username field. The initial value is empty quotes as you can see. So let us enter some value here. So the nerdy dev, and you can see we are getting the values here as well because we are pulling the values of these fields from the state and we are rendering them right here. And let us enter value for the email. So the nerdy dev at gmail.com, and let us enter a password, say 123456, and now let us click on register. So you can see it says you are now registered and can now log in. And now our form is set back to its original configuration. If we check the console, you can see we are getting the form data object where we are having the username, the password and the email being logged to our console. And now if I submit the form without specifying any value for our form controls, you can see the errors are getting rendered right here. So our validation logic is also working fine. And let me specify some value for the controls and then click on register. You can see one error is now gone. To eliminate others, let us specify the value for other fields as well. Click on this. So now only password is left blank. Let us add some value. Click, and everything works fine. So this was all about the video on controlled components where we discussed what they are. Then we saw how we can keep our form state in sync with the input controls. Next we saw how we can submit our form using the onSubmit event on the form tag. Lastly, we defined some simple validation logic for validating our form controls for blank values. So in the next video, we will see how we can use a text area in the form. So let's catch up in the next one.